She had prosecuted liars for 11 years. She simply hadn't thought to prosecute the one sleeping in her bed. Brooke Alfred moved through the corridor of the Schiller Grand with the particular stillness of a woman who had learned to keep her face 1 full second ahead of her feelings. 14 hours from Atlanta, 3 days from a wedding she had planned with the same precision she brought to federal cases. Heels clicking against marble floors the color of bone, carry-on behind her because the bellhop had vanished, and waiting was something she'd stopped doing somewhere around age 25. The suite door was cracked open. She registered it as a logistical error first, housekeeping, a latch that didn't catch. Then she heard her maid of honor, Simone's laugh. Low and lazy and completely at home, in a room that was supposed to be Brooke's alone. She didn't push the door open dramatically. She simply stopped walking, one hand finding the doorframe, and gave herself exactly 3 seconds to understand what she was seeing. Derek, her husband-to-be, Simone, and spread open on the coffee table between them, her father's patent portfolio. Everything Bernard Alfred had spent his life building. Every invention, every idea, every asset he had carefully protected for his daughter was spread open on that table in the wrong hands. Her father's name printed at the top in the same font Brooke had been reading since she was 9 years old. Derek's finger was tracing a line near the bottom of the transfer page, the one requiring a spouse's countersignature. Derek needed her to become his wife before he could legally take everything her father had left her. The wedding had never been about love. It had always been about a signature. She understood it in the space of a single breath. Derek wasn't marrying her. He was acquiring her signature. And her father's patents would transfer to a third party the moment she became his wife. She had spent 40 hours drafting the legal mechanism that would have made it airtight. She had built the cage herself without knowing she was inside it. Her jaw tightened. That was the only visible thing, the small pull of muscle along her jawline, the single slow blink. She was a criminal defense attorney. She had sat across from murderers without flinching. Stillness was not a coping mechanism for her. It was a weapon. She used it now. She pulled the door shut quietly, turned around, walked back the way she came. She didn't cry in the elevator. She did the math instead. How long Derek had access to her legal files, when his family's merger conversations had started, whether his proposal had been timed to the exact quarter her father's estate cleared probate. By the 3rd floor, she had enough of an answer to make her stomach go cold and completely, terribly quiet. She had run due diligence on Derek's family before the engagement. Standard practice. She'd have done it for a client she wasn't, going to skip it for a husband. But the corporate trail had been clean, deliberately, architecturally clean. Whatever was connected to Derek's family had been buried under enough shell structures that even she hadn't found the bottom of it. She understood now that the cleanliness itself had been the warning she'd missed. She sat at the far end of the hotel bar, ordered sparkling water, and stared at nothing. That was when she felt it, a shift in the air beside her. Not movement exactly, more like the room rearranging itself around a new presence. She didn't look up immediately. She had learned that the people worth watching were always the ones who didn't demand to be watched. When she did look, she found a man 2 seats away in a charcoal suit, watching the entrance with a stillness so deliberate it felt practiced. Korean, late 30s, jaw set hard enough to look architectural. He was speaking low to the man standing behind his left shoulder, and Brooke's functional Korean caught one word before she could stop it. Yangdo, transfer. The same word printed 14 times across her father's patent documents upstairs. Her body registered it before her mind caught up. A slow tightening across her shoulders, a breath she took half a second, too carefully. She didn't look at him. She listened instead as he finished his instructions, and the other man nodded once and disappeared. Then the room went quiet. She already knew what she would find before she pulled out her phone. The holding company name from the transfer document. 3 seconds of searching. One photograph loading slowly on her screen. Charcoal suit, architectural jaw. 2 seats away, the receiving corporate entity. The company waiting quietly in the background to receive her father's entire legacy the moment she became Derek's wife. Someone had been building toward this moment for a very long time. Brooke put her phone face down on the bar, opened her legal notepad, uncapped her pen with one quiet click. He spoke then, quietly, in perfect, unhurried English, directed at no one in particular. The sparkling water here is better than the still. Good choice. Too precise to be accidental, too casual to be a coincidence. Brooke wrote one line across the top of the blank page without looking up. Then she allowed herself the smallest, most controlled exhale. Not relief, not fear. Recalibration. She had been placed in this moment. Every instinct she owned confirmed it. She finished writing her line, capped her pen, and finally turned to look at him directly for the first time. Now she was ready to begin. He didn't introduce himself. That was the first thing she noted, professionally, automatically, the way she noted everything. A man with nothing to hide led with his name. Lee Gyong-si simply turned from the bar entrance he'd been watching and looked at her with the particular patience of someone who had already decided how this conversation would end. Brooke held his gaze without adjusting her posture. "You knew I'd be at this bar." Not a question. She didn't waste questions on things she already knew. "I knew you'd need somewhere quiet." His English was precise, unhurried, carrying the faint architecture of someone who had learned the language for utility rather than pleasure. "After what you found upstairs." Brooke said nothing. She had learned early in her career that silence was the most honest response to a man who already knew too much. "How long have you been watching Derek's family?" she said finally. "Long enough." He picked up his glass, set it down without drinking. "Long enough to know that the patent portfolio was never about the merger, that your name was used to file 3 unauthorized corporate instruments in the last 8 months, before any wedding, before any signature from you, and that you didn't know any of it until 40 minutes ago." Someone had been signing her professional name to documents she had never seen and never approved, which meant she was legally responsible for deals she knew nothing about. Her name was on crimes she hadn't committed, and her career was the collateral. "They used my holding company as the receiving entity for the transfer, without my knowledge and without my authorization," he continued. "When I discovered it, I had 2 options: move against them immediately and lose the evidence trail, or wait until the right moment and remove them completely." A pause. The wedding was going to be that moment. You finding that room changed the sequence, not the outcome. The air between them tightened. Brooke felt it across the back of her neck, a slow cellular awareness that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with proximity to something genuinely dangerous. 3 unauthorized instruments. That was federal exposure with her bar license attached to it. Not just her reputation, her entire career. 11 years of cases, clients, and hard-won credibility. 1 federal inquiry with her name at the top, and all of it was gone. Derek hadn't just betrayed her. He had professionally dismantled her and handed her the wreckage as a wedding gift. She kept her face still. "What do you want?" "The same thing you want." He turned to face her fully for the first time, and the directness of it was almost physical, like a door opening onto cold air. "Derek's family removed from every table they currently sit at, permanently." "You're proposing something," she said. He set his glass down, looked at her with an evenness that should have felt cold, and instead felt like the most honest thing anyone had offered her in months. "The wedding happens tomorrow. The guests, the venue, the flowers, all of it stays exactly as you planned it. The only thing that changes is the man standing at that altar." A pause, precise and deliberate. "That man will be me." Brooke held very still, not from shock, from the specific internal calibration she performed before walking into a courtroom. She already knew she was going to win. She recognized the feeling immediately. She was more disturbed by that recognition than by anything he'd just said. Your terms, she said. Public ceremony, 1 year of legal marriage, long enough to dismantle what Derek's family built using your credentials. Your father's patents returned within 72 hours. He paused. I have the legal mechanism already prepared. Of course he did. He had been preparing to undo Derek's damage long before she found out it existed. The paperwork was already written and waiting. He had been watching this situation unfold long before Brooke had any idea she was inside it. My terms, Brooke said. Separate lives, no interference in my practice, no decisions made in my name without my explicit approval. She held his gaze without blinking. And I see the legal mechanism before I sign anything. Tonight. Something crossed his face. Too fast to name. Gone before she could classify it. A warmth that had no business being in a negotiation. It was there and then it wasn't, and he gave no indication it had happened at all. Tonight, he agreed. He slid a document across the bar toward her. 12 pages, her full legal name printed at the top. But that wasn't what stopped her breath. Her father's signature was on page 3, notarized, dated 14 months ago, 8 months before Derek had ever proposed. Brooke read every word of all 12 pages without looking up. He waited without fidgeting, without checking his phone, without doing anything except existing, beside her with that unnerving, practiced stillness. When she finished, she set the document down and looked at him with the full weight of everything she now understood. My father knew, she said. Not a question, not an accusation, just the truth arriving. He came to me. Gyeongsi's voice dropped a register, just slightly, just enough to tell her this was the one part of the conversation he hadn't rehearsed. He was worried someone would try to use you to get to his work after he was gone. He wanted a contingency. His eyes held hers. I was the contingency. Brooke looked back down at her father's signature for a long moment. Something moved through her chest that she couldn't afford to feel in this bar, in front of this man, tonight. She filed it away with the same efficiency she'd filed everything else. She picked up her pen, signed her name slowly, deliberately. When she looked up, he was watching her hand rather than her face. And in the half-second before he caught himself and looked away, she saw something in his expression that had no place in a business arrangement. She said nothing about it, but she reached for her legal notepad, wrote one line, and turned it toward him so he could read it. I want to know everything my father told you, all of it. He read it, looked up. And for the first time since she'd sat down, Lee Gyeong-si looked like a man who hadn't fully anticipated what was coming next. Good, Brooke thought. Now they were even. Hi fam, welcome to Afro-Korean Series channel. Thanks for listening. It's so lovely to have you here. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Brooke had planned a 45-minute wedding with a string quartet, 2 scripture readings, and a reception that cost more than her first car. What she got instead was a civil officiant, 2 witnesses she'd never met, and a man beside her at the altar who smelled faintly of cedarwood and something darker underneath that she didn't have a name for yet. She kept her eyes forward the entire time. The guests were confused in the specific way that wealthy people expressed confusion, through stillness and expensive silence rather than open reaction. Derek's family sat in the 3rd row. She didn't look at them either. She had learned that the most devastating thing you could do to people who expected your collapse was to give them your profile instead. Chin level, shoulders back, the particular posture of a woman who had decided. When the officiant asked if she took this man, Brooke turned and looked at Gyeong-si directly for the first time since the bar. He was already looking at her, not with the detached patience she'd catalogued the night before, with something more careful than that, something that moved across his face in the half-second before his expression settled, like a man checking himself at the edge of a feeling he hadn't budgeted for. I do, she said, clearly, without hesitation. His jaw tightened once, barely visible, gone immediately. I do, he said. The ring was a single band of cold platinum that fit perfectly. She noted that without commenting on it. Then she noted quietly and professionally that she hadn't once questioned the legal validity of what had just occurred, and that a woman of her credentials absolutely should have. She filed that lapse away with everything else she wasn't examining yet. The penthouse was 53 floors above Seoul's noise, and Brooke felt the silence of it immediately, not as peace, but as pressure. She stood at the window in her heels with her legal notepad in one hand, aware with a precision she resented of exactly where Gyeong-si was standing behind her. "Your room is the second door on the left," he said. "The staff won't disturb you." "I want to continue our conversation from last night," she said. "About my father." "Tomorrow," his voice was even. "Tonight you should rest." She turned from the window. "I'll determine what I need tonight." He looked at her across the length of the room. Something moved behind his eyes, not irritation, something closer to recognition, like a man watching a reflection of a quality he understood in himself and hadn't expected to find here. "One condition," he said. "You don't set conditions on information that belongs to me." The silence between them had weight. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. She counted, and then walked to the kitchen without another word. Poured 2 cups of coffee, set one on the counter closest to her. She crossed the room and picked it up. He told her then. Not everything. She understood instinctively that everything would come in increments, earned rather than given. Her father had found a discrepancy in Derek's family's corporate filings 18 months before he died, had traced it quietly, methodically, alone, had found Gyeong-si's name at the end of that trail, and made a decision Brooke was only now beginning to understand the full weight of. "He came to me directly," Gyeong-si said. "He sat in my office for 2 hours. He wasn't afraid of what I was." A pause. "He was only afraid of what would happen to you after he was gone." Brooke kept her face still. "When did he know he was dying?" "Before he told you." She absorbed that quietly. Set her coffee down. Gyeong-si reached into his inside jacket pocket and placed a small envelope on the counter between them. Cream-colored. Her name written across the front in her father's handwriting. The particular slant she'd been reading her whole life, the capital B that always leaned slightly left. She didn't touch it immediately. She looked at it for a long moment. The way you looked at something you understood would change the internal architecture of everything once you picked it up. "He said to give it to you after," Gyeong-si said quietly. "After the contingency activated. After you were safe." Brooke picked up the envelope, held it in both hands. The paper was slightly worn at the edges. He had carried it for a long time. Gyeong-si had carried her father's words to her daughter for months, maybe longer, waiting for a moment he hoped would never have to come. She didn't open it, not here, not in front of anyone. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was level, controlled. The only sign of what it cost her was the single careful breath she took before she spoke. Gyeong-si said nothing. He simply looked at her with that quality of attention she was beginning to recognize. Unhurried, undemanding, witnessing without requiring anything from what he saw. She picked up her notepad, slid it across the island. "He was right to trust you." "I haven't decided yet if I am." He read it, wrote beneath her line without hesitation, and slid it back. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years." Brooke looked at those words. Then she picked up the envelope, picked up her coffee, and walked to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark with her father's letter in her hands for a long time before she opened it. She read it once, then again. Then she folded it carefully back along its original creases and held it against her chest with both hands and let herself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, everything the day had cost her. Then she filed it away, lay back on the covers fully dressed, stared at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown Seoul number. One message. The wedding made the news. Derek's family gave a statement. "You need to read it." Brooke sat up slowly, reached for her phone. Read the headline that had already gathered 400 comments in the 2 hours since the ceremony ended. She read it twice, set the phone face down on the nightstand. Then she picked up her notepad, walked back out to the kitchen, and set it in front of Fiancé without a word. She had written 3 lines. They're saying, "I married you for your money," that Derek broke the engagement because he found out. They're controlling the narrative. We need to talk about how we control it back. Fiancé read it, looked up, and for the second time since she'd met him, she saw something in his expression that had no business being in a business arrangement. Something that looked very much like the specific satisfaction of a man watching someone become exactly who he already knew they were. "Sit down, Brooke," he said, using her name for the first time. She sat. 6 days into their arrangement, Brooke had mapped him the way she mapped everything, through pattern and absence. He woke before she did. She knew this because the coffee was always ready when she emerged, and the kitchen always carried the faint trace of cedarwood that she had stopped pretending she didn't notice. He worked late. She could see the light under his study door from the hallway when she passed at midnight. He ate alone at the kitchen island, reading documents she never asked about. He never entered a room she was already in without a small announcement of presence, a cleared throat, a deliberate footstep that she understood, after 3 days, was not coincidence, but consideration. The media narrative had been contained by day 3. Their joint statement, Brooke had written it. Fiancé had distributed it through channels she didn't ask about. Reframed the wedding as a long-standing private arrangement, Derek's exit as mutual, and Brooke's presence in Seoul as professional rather than romantic. The comments had shifted. Derek's family had gone quiet. Neither of them had discussed it since. They had simply moved forward the way 2 people moved forward when they had independently decided that forward was the only direction worth facing. He was the most disciplined person she had ever shared space with, which was why she knew immediately, on the 6th night, that something was wrong. She was still at her desk at 2 a.m., working through a client brief when she heard him come in. Later than usual, quieter than usual. No cedarwood tonight. Something heavier underneath. She sat still and listened to the penthouse settle around his movements and counted the sounds. Front door, hallway, living room. Then nothing. No study light under her door, no kitchen sounds, just silence sitting in the apartment with a different quality than it usually had. She got up, left the brief open on her desk, walked out with nothing in her hands. He was in the living room in the dark, still in his suit jacket, sitting in the chair that faced the door. Not the window, she noted. Always the door. Even now, even like this, some part of him was still running the room. His hands were on his knees. His face was turned toward the glass, but his eyes were tracking the room's perimeter in the automatic way of a man who had stopped being able to turn that instinct off years ago. He didn't react when she entered, but she understood from the slight adjustment of his shoulders that he had registered her presence the moment she crossed the threshold and had simply chosen not to perform composure on her behalf. That choice, the decision to let her see him without the architecture, registered somewhere behind her ribs as something significant. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer anything. She simply crossed the room, sat on the sofa closest to his chair, and stayed. The silence between them reorganized itself. It stopped being the silence of a man alone and became something else. The silence of 2 people in the same room, choosing not to need anything from each other, and finding that choice oddly sustaining. Her grandmother used to call it keeping watch. You didn't fix anything. You didn't fill the air with words that were really just your own discomfort looking for somewhere to land. You simply stayed present inside someone else's hard moment and let your presence be the thing you offered. Brooke had learned it at 70 years of black women, who knew that sometimes the most radical act of love was simply refusing to leave. She was thinking about that when he spoke. His name was Park Sung-jin. Gyeongsi's voice was low and completely level in the way that voices were level when the alternative was something the speaker had decided not to allow. He worked with me for 11 years. He had a daughter in Busan who is 7 years old. Brooke gave his words the respect of not reacting to them too, quickly. Then she looked at him. How did it happen? A message, directed at me. His jaw worked once. He intercepted it. She absorbed that. The geometry of it, a man stepping into the path of something intended for Fiancé. And underneath that, the quieter calculation her attorney's mind made automatically, and without her permission, that she was legally married to a man who was currently someone's target, that her name was on documents tied to his, that proximity to this had professional and personal consequences she had not fully accounted for when she signed that contract 6 days ago. She registered all of it, set it aside, stayed anyway. That choice felt important in a way she wasn't ready to examine. Tell me about him, she said instead. Park Sung-jin. Something moved across Gyeong-si's face that she didn't have a classification for yet. Then he told her. A man who made terrible jokes at inappropriate moments, who kept a photograph of his daughter taped inside his locker, who had once eaten an entire platter of galbi at a client dinner because he thought it was rude to waste food and had absolutely no regrets about it. Brooke listened without interrupting. She had learned in 11 years of criminal defense that the most profound thing you could offer a grieving person was witness. The simple act of holding space for what they needed to say without trying to resolve it into something more comfortable. Her grandmother had taught her that too, she realized, long before any courtroom had. When he finished, they sat in silence. After a while, Brooke went to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of coffee. She set one beside his chair without comment. He looked at it, then at her. You don't have to stay, he said. I know, she said, and stayed. Seoul glittered below them, indifferent and enormous. Brooke sat with her legs tucked under her and listened to him breathe, steady and slow and quietly effortful, the breathing of a man refusing to come apart in front of another person. She understood that effort intimately, had performed it herself at her father's funeral, while relatives told her Bernard would have wanted her to be strong, as though strength was the only language black women were permitted to grieve in. She had stood at that graveside composed and contained, and had not cried until she was alone in her rental car 3 hours later. She wondered if Gyeong-si had anyone who let him be something other than strong. She suspected from the quality of his surprise when she'd simply sat down that the answer was no. It occurred to her, sitting in that dark room at 2 a.m, that she had fundamentally misread what this arrangement was going to require of her. She had prepared for negotiation, for strategy, for the careful management of proximity to a dangerous man. She had not prepared for the possibility that he was also, underneath all of it, simply someone trying not to drown, alone. She filed that thought carefully, but it stayed near the surface all night. The call came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. Brooke was already up. She had been sleeping less since the 6th night, though she hadn't examined why, standing at the kitchen window with her first coffee when her mother's name appeared on her screen. She answered before the second ring. Vivian Alfred's voice was controlled in the specific way that meant she had been awake for hours, managing something she hadn't wanted to call about. Baby, I need you to listen before you react. Brooke set her coffee down. Tell me. The Alfred family home in Atlanta's West End, the house Bernard had owned outright, mortgage-free for 22 years, had been flagged in a probate challenge filed 3 days ago. Derek's family had found a clerical error in the estate transfer documentation and had used it to freeze the property's legal status. The filing had been deliberately misrouted through a compromised junior clerk, bypassing the automated alert system Brooke had set up on all estate-related filings after her father's death. Someone had known exactly where her monitoring had gaps. Brooke was already moving toward her room before her mother finished the sentence. Don't sign anything. Don't speak to anyone from their legal team without me on the phone. I'll call my colleague Patricia Wynne at the firm. She'll file an emergency stay before the courthouse opens. She was on the phone with Patricia before she'd finished packing. Case strategy mapped, filings queued, Local resources activated. She was not going to Atlanta without a full legal team already moving. She was packed in 20 minutes. She found Fiancé in the hallway when she opened her door, suited, phone in hand, entirely unsurprised by her carry-on. "I heard," he said. "I've had someone monitoring the Alfred estate filings since the wedding. When the alert came through last night, I had travel arranged by midnight." His eyes held hers steadily. "I have business in Atlanta. The timing is what it is." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been monitoring my family's legal filings." "I've been monitoring everything connected to Derek's family." A pause. "Your father's estate is connected to Derek's family." It was a precise and deliberate answer that was also completely true, and told her nothing about where his monitoring ended and his interest in her specifically began. She noted that, filed it, let it go. "Don't clear anything without telling me first," she said. Something moved in his expression. Not agreement, exactly. The specific look of a man making a calculation about which promises were worth making. "Noted," he said. And she understood from the weight of that single word that it was the most honest answer he was capable of giving her right now. She let it be enough. Atlanta received her the way it always did, with heat and red clay, and the specific smell of summer that lived in her chest, like a compass needle swinging home. She stood outside, Hartsfield-Jackson, and felt the city settle around her shoulders, like something she hadn't known she'd been missing. Fiancé stood beside her and said nothing. But she caught him watching Atlanta with the focused attention he brought to every room he entered, cataloguing, assessing, learning its geometry. She wondered what the city looked like through his eyes. Then she wondered why she was wondering, and redirected her attention to her phone, where Patricia had already filed the emergency stay. They moved in separate orbits during the day. Brooke went to the courthouse, then to Derek's family's Atlanta attorneys, where she sat across a conference table and dismantled their challenge procedurally, methodically, using granular estate law they hadn't anticipated her knowing at this level. Patricia worked the filings from the office. By 3 p.m., the challenge had been reduced from a legitimate legal threat to an expensive inconvenience with a clear resolution timeline. She discovered that evening that 2 administrative obstacles had quietly cleared between 10 a.m. and noon before she'd gotten to them. She sat across from Fiancé at her mother's kitchen table. Vivian had insisted on dinner, and Fiancé had accepted with a grace that had visibly recalibrated her mother's expectations, and looked at him steadily. "You cleared 2 of the filing obstacles. I told you I had business in Atlanta." Fiancé. He met her eyes without flinching. "I said I wouldn't clear anything without telling you. I'm telling you now." "That's not what that means, and you know it." "I know." His voice was even, unhurried. "I also know that those 2 obstacles would have cost you 4 additional days, and I had the mechanism to remove them in 2 hours. Your preference for handling things independently doesn't outweigh your mother's right to her home." A pause. The quiet certainty of a man who had already decided and was simply being honest about it. "I'll always work in your perimeter, Brooke. I'll be less visible about it, but I won't apologize for the outcome." She held his gaze for a long moment. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in recent memory, even if it was also the most infuriating. "We're going to revisit this conversation," she said. "I know," he said, and reached for his bowl. The kitchen was warm around them, smelling of the jollof rice Vivian had made without asking anyone's preference. A West African kitchen, asserting itself in an Atlanta house the way it always had, feeding people as its first language. Fiancé had eaten 2 full plates without being asked, and had complimented Vivian with the specific attention of a man who understood that food was not just food in this house. Vivian Alfred was not an easy woman to impress. She refilled his bowl herself. "She has your father's eyes," Fiancé said quietly when Vivian stepped out. No ornamentation, simply a thing he meant completely. Brooke looked down at the table, felt his gaze on the side of her face, warm and steady and unhurried. and did not look up until her expression was fully her own again. They stayed in separate rooms at the Waldorf on Peachtree, her terms, honored without discussion. But walking back through Atlanta's evening heat after dinner, the city loud and alive around them, Brooke became aware of a shift that had been accumulating without her permission. The professional distance she maintained with the precision of a woman who understood exactly what was at stake was still present, still intact, but it was thinner than it had been in soul. She noticed his hand near hers as they walked, not touching, not reaching, simply present at a proximity that was closer than professional and not yet anything else. The Atlanta heat pressed around them, and she was acutely, inconveniently aware of the warmth radiating from his arm near hers. The specific awareness of skin near skin without contact, the friction of his suit jacket sleeve against the bare air beside her arm, that made her breath come 1 degree more carefully than usual. She didn't move away. He didn't close the distance. They walked the remaining 2 blocks in that particular suspension, almost, and not yet, and both of them knowing it. And Brooke filed the feeling away in the part of herself she was rapidly running out of room in. She was going to need a larger filing system. He was waiting in the lobby of the shared legal suite she'd been using on Gangnam-dero on a Wednesday morning. Brooke saw him before he saw her. She had learned in 11 years of criminal defense to always see first, and gave herself exactly 2 seconds to register the fact of him before her face went completely still, and she walked forward anyway. Derek looked different. Not performatively different. Not a new suit or a careful haircut designed to signal change. Something quieter than that. The particular stillness of a man who had stopped performing confidence because he'd lost the thing generating it. He looked for the first time since she'd known him, like someone she might have actually chosen if he'd shown up this way 3 years ago. That observation cost her something. She filed the cost away without examining it. "I'm not here for the patents," he said before she reached him. "I want you to know that first." "I know," she said, because she did. Her attorneys. Mind had already run the calculation. Derek had nothing left to gain professionally. His family's position had been systematically dismantled, and he had come to Seoul on what she suspected were his last viable resources anyway, which meant this was personal, which made it more complicated, not less. She didn't invite him upstairs. They sat in the lobby cafe and she ordered coffee she didn't intend to drink, and looked at him across the table with the full weight of everything she now knew. "Say what you came to say," she said. He said it, carefully, without excuses, without the defensive architecture she'd expected. He had been wrong. He had allowed his family to use her in ways he hadn't fully understood until it was already done. Which was its own kind of culpability, she noted internally, the sin of deliberately not looking. He had spent months understanding that. He had come to understand other things too. "I chose wrong," he said simply. "Every version of wrong. Available to me, I chose it. I know that." He looked at her steadily. "But I knew you before all of this, before you were anyone's wife or anyone's legal strategy, and I'm asking if there's any version of this where—" "Derek," he stopped. She held his gaze without anger, without coldness. She had spent her entire life learning to sit across from complicated feelings without letting them show. Not because she was naturally composed, but because she had learned early that black women were rarely granted the luxury of visible complexity. Other people's comfort with her emotions had always been her problem to manage. She had become exceptionally good at it. Right now she was using every bit of that skill to give him the honest answer he deserved, without letting him see what the honest answer cost her. "I hear you," she said quietly. "I believe every word of this, and it doesn't change anything." Because of him, not accusatory, just honest. She thought about the real answer to that question. Was it because of Gyeong-si? Or was it because of who she had become in the space his presence had created? The woman who had walked back to that kitchen with a notepad, who had sat in the dark keeping watch, who had stood on an Atlanta sidewalk choosing not to move away. "Because of me," she said. "It's because of me." Derek looked at her for a long moment, Then something in his face settled. Not defeat, something more like a man finally putting down weight he'd been carrying in the wrong direction. "He's not what people think he is. I know what he is," she said quietly. "All of it. And you're staying. I'm staying." He nodded once, stood, straightened his jacket with the care of a man reconstructing his dignity in real time. "You look different," he said. "Good different, like you stopped waiting for something." He left before she could respond. She sat with her untouched coffee and turned his last observation over carefully. Not the apology, not the admission, but that, like you stopped waiting for something. She examined it the way she examined evidence, looking for the truth inside it, and found that it didn't make her uncomfortable the way it should have. That told her everything. Her phone screen lit up. Gyeongsi. She looked at it for 3 full seconds before she answered. She already knew what it meant that he was calling now. He'd known Derek was in Seoul before she'd arrived at the building this morning. She was certain of it, which meant he had known and had said nothing, and had let her walk into that lobby on her own terms. The deliberateness of that restraint landed somewhere in her chest with quiet and significant weight. "Where are you?" he said. "Lobby cafe on Gangnam Dairo," she said. "Derek was here." A silence. 2 seconds. 3. The specific texture of a man exercising enormous restraint. "Are you all right?" he said. Not what did he want, not what did you tell him. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." She paused. She was giving more than she normally would, and she knew it, could feel the precise moment where her usual measured disclosure ended and something less guarded began. She gave it anyway. "I told him I was staying." Another silence, shorter. When he spoke, his voice was the same, even, controlled, giving her nothing she hadn't asked for. "I'll have coffee ready," he said, and ended the call. Brooke sat for a moment with her phone in her hand and her untouched coffee going cold in front of her, and thought about a man who had known about Derek all morning and said nothing, who responded to the most significant thing she'd said in weeks by offering her something warm to come home to. She picked up her bag, stood, walked toward the exit with the specific purposefulness of a woman who had stopped waiting for something and finally understood what she'd been waiting for instead. She found out on a Thursday, not from Gyeongsi. He was already gone by the time she woke, which was not unusual. Not from his staff, who moved through the penthouse with the specific discretion of people trained to reveal nothing. She found out from a news alert on her phone at 7 a.m., a brief item on a Korean financial wire about Lee Gyong-si cancelling 3 consecutive meetings without explanation, which in Seoul's corporate circles apparently constituted a significant enough anomaly to report. She read it twice, and then she saw the name of the faction the financial wire had tactfully not connected to the cancellations, but which appeared 2 articles down in her search results, and something cold moved through her chest because she knew that name. Had been looking at it for months without understanding what she was looking at. It was threaded through her father's estate research, like a root system she'd been mapping from the wrong end. She had been building leverage against these people for over a year without knowing it. She called his number. It rang out. She called the second number he'd given her for emergencies. A man answered whose voice she didn't recognize, and who told her in careful, uninflected English that Mr. Lee was unavailable and that she should remain at the penthouse until further notice. The call disconnected before she could respond. Brooke sat on the edge of the bed in the early morning quiet and felt the shape of what was happening move through her with cold clarity. He was gone. Someone had taken him. She pressed her palm flat against the mattress and felt the steadiness of it beneath her hand, and took a breath that didn't fully catch the first time. She took it again. A specific thought of Gyeong-si's face, composed, architectural, the half-second of warmth he never quite managed to hide, moved through her before she shut it down. 60 seconds. She gave herself exactly that. Then she got up and opened her laptop. She called Patricia Wynne in Atlanta first, not for legal help, but for a Seoul-based corporate investigator Patricia had worked with on an international case 2 years prior. A man named Cho Dae-jung, who operated in the legitimate space between financial forensics and due diligence, and who, Patricia said, knew every corporate structure in this city worth knowing. Brooke called him. He owed Patricia nothing, but he owed Brooke a debt from a securities case she'd quietly resolved in his favor 3 years ago. He gave her what she needed within 2 hours. A thread, incomplete but real, that told her where Gyeongsi was being held and what they wanted in exchange. A territorial concession, signatures on documents ceding 3 legitimate business holdings to the faction she'd spent the last hour confirming she had significant federal exposure material on. She opened her legal notepad, wrote for 40 minutes, then made 4 calls, methodical, precise, each one placing specific pressure on a specific point in the faction's legitimate corporate structure. She wasn't threatening anyone. She was making clear, in the careful language of someone who understood exactly how federal exposure worked, that certain documentation might find its way to certain interested parties unless a private resolution was reached before noon. At 11:47 a.m., her phone rang. "Mr. Lee will be returned within the hour," the voice said, as a professional courtesy. "Noted," Brooke said, and ended the call. She was in the kitchen when she heard the front door. She didn't move. She listened to his footsteps cross the hallway, slightly uneven, which told her enough, and heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. She kept her back to him, finished making the coffee. She was acutely aware of him behind her, the specific gravity of his presence in a room, the way the air pressure changed when he entered a space. She had been noticing it for weeks and filing it away. Right now, with her, hands on the coffee cups, and her heart doing something she was firmly not acknowledging, she had nowhere left to file it. She set 2 cups on the island, turned. His face was composed. His left jaw was not, a bruise developing along the bone with the coloring of something recent. His suit jacket was gone. She crossed to the island and sat across from him, and felt the specific heat of him on the other side of the marble. Closer than usual, or perhaps she was simply more aware of the distance than she'd been before today. "You negotiated my release," he said. "I had leverage that was relevant. I used it." "Brooke." Her name in his voice landed differently than it ever had, lower, more careful, resonating somewhere in her chest at a frequency she felt before she heard it. "You declared war on a faction that has been operating in this city for 20 years. "I declared war on a corporate structure with federal exposure," she said. "They made the choice to connect it to you." He looked at her across the island, the same island where they had drunk coffee the night she'd read her father's letter, where she had slid notepads across the marble between them for weeks, where they had built something neither of them had named yet. "Why?" he said. "Just that." She had a prepared answer, professional, precise, structured around the terms of their arrangement and the practical necessity of his continued presence in resolving Derek's family's remaining interests. She opened her mouth to deliver it. "The terms of our arrangement require," she started, and then something shifted. Some internal architecture that had been holding a particular weight gave way quietly, and she stopped and looked at him and gave him the truth instead. "You kept my father's letter for 8 months, she said. Her voice was even, but only just. "You carried it until I needed it. You sat outside a courthouse in Atlanta to clear a path you knew I needed to clear myself." A pause. "I know what you are, all of it, and none of it changes what I just did or why I did it." The silence between them had a different quality than any silence they'd shared before. Fuller, more honest. The silence of 2 people who had run out of professional distance to hide inside. His hand moved across the island, not reaching, arriving. His fingers rested on the marble 2 inches from hers. The warmth of it crossed that gap and registered along the inside of her wrist, moved up through her forearm, settled at the base of her throat with a heat that had nothing to do with the kitchen and everything to do with him. She looked at his hand, then at his face. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Stripped of the architectural composure, stripped of the careful distance. Simply a man waiting with everything he had for something he hadn't been sure he'd be allowed to keep. She closed the 2 inches herself, his fingers folded over hers slowly, completely, with the quiet certainty of something that had been decided long before either of them admitted it. Neither of them spoke. Outside, Seoul moved through its evening indifferent and enormous. Inside the penthouse kitchen, 2 people sat across a marble island with their hands finally together in the specific silence of something that had stopped being an arrangement a long time ago and was only now, at last, telling the truth about what it was. The Seoul International Business Gala was the kind of event that existed to remind people where they stood. Brooke had attended 3 of them in her career, always as someone's guest, always in a professional capacity, always with the specific awareness of a black woman in a room full of people who had decided her presence required explanation. She had learned to wear Seoul's old money circles the way she wore a courtroom, with complete external composure and a comprehensive internal map of every exit. Tonight, she wore both. And a dress the color of midnight that she had chosen herself, had spent 40 minutes choosing, had stood in front of the mirror with the specific intentionality of a woman who understood that how you entered a room was its own kind of argument. They arrived together, not performing togetherness, simply moving through the same space with the ease of 2 people who had stopped negotiating the distance between them. Gyeong-si's hand settled at the small of her back as they entered, and Brooke felt it through the fabric like a current finding its ground. Warm and certain and entirely deliberate. Not possessive, not performative, simply present in the specific way of a man who had learned exactly where he was allowed to stand, and chose to stand there with his whole self. She felt the warmth of his palm spread outward from that single point of contact, moving up through her spine, steadying something in her chest that the room had been trying to unsettle since they walked through the door. She didn't lean into it. She didn't move away. She let it anchor her. In a room full of people who had already decided what her presence meant, his hand at her back was the one thing that had nothing to do with what anyone else had decided. It was simply his, simply hers, simply true. The room rearranged itself around their entrance, the way rooms rearrange themselves around Gyeong-si, a subtle gravitational shift, conversations pausing, fractionally, eyes tracking without appearing to track. Brooke had spent her career learning to read rooms. This one was reading them back. Derek's family was positioned near the east entrance. She clocked them without looking directly. 3 of them. A legal representative she recognized from the courthouse filings, and a woman holding a document folder with the specific grip of someone about to do something they'd been rehearsing. She noted it, kept moving. The first hour passed in the specific rhythm of these events. Conversations that were really negotiations, compliments that were really assessments, the elaborate social choreography of people with too much money and not enough honesty. Gyeong-si stayed close without hovering. She was aware of him the way she was aware of her own breathing, constantly, naturally, without having to think about it. She was midway through a conversation with a Korean appellate judge when she felt the room shift. Derek's family had moved to the center. The woman with the document folder was speaking to a cluster of press near the podium. The legal representative was distributing what appeared to be a bound presentation to 3 of Seoul's most prominent business journalists. Brooke excused herself without hurrying. She had read enough of Derek's family's legal strategy to recognize what was happening. Forged documentation suggesting she had manipulated the original merger, the same merger that Gyeong-si's legal team had flagged as already under federal review before she'd ever arrived in Seoul. A detail she had filed carefully when he'd told her in their second week and was now profoundly grateful for. The narrative was designed to destroy her professional reputation, nullify her bar standing, and reframe everything she'd built as calculated fraud. She was still mapping her response when Gyeong-si reached the podium. She hadn't seen him move. He was simply elsewhere, and then he was there, at the center of the room, with the complete authority of a man who had never once questioned his right to occupy any space he chose to enter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'd like to address the documentation being distributed," he said in English, then Korean, giving the room no excuse not to understand him. Specifically the 3 procedural irregularities in the filing dates, the forged notarization on Exhibit C, and the rather significant problem that the merger Brooke Alfred is accused of manipulating was already under federal review before she arrived in Seoul. He paused. The room was completely still. "I have the documentation, all of it. My legal team will provide full copies tonight." Derek's family's legal representative opened his mouth. Gyeong-si looked at him with the specific quality of stillness that meant the conversation was already over, and the other person simply hadn't been informed yet. The representative closed his mouth. Gyeong-si stepped back from the podium, and then he looked at Brooke across the length of the gala floor and gave her the floor, not with words but with the deliberate quality of his attention, the slight tilt of his head, the step back that said, "This is yours," as clearly as anything he could have spoken. Brooke walked to the podium. She took one breath, and in that breath she felt it. The full, specific weight of standing in this room, in this city, as this woman. The weight of every room she had entered alone and been required to justify her presence in before she'd spoken a single word. The weight of 11 years of being twice as precise, twice as documented, twice as unassailable as anyone else before her credibility was granted, rather than assumed. She felt all of it move through her in that single breath. Then she set it aside, stepped forward, and spoke. 4 minutes, methodical, surgical, public, addressing each document, each filing date, each forged signature with the specific citation of a woman who had been building this case file in her sleep for weeks. She didn't raise her voice once. When she finished, the room was quiet, in the way that meant something had been decided that couldn't be undecided. Derek's family left through the east entrance. Nobody watched them go. Brooke stepped back from the podium and found Gyeong-si beside her. Not behind, not in front. Beside, at the exact distance of someone who had learned precisely where he was allowed to stand. He looked at the room. Then something moved across his face. Something she recognized as a man arriving at the edge of a true thing he hadn't said out loud before. He opened his mouth, started a word, stopped, started again. "She doesn't need me to..." A pause, the briefest redirect of a man finding the right words in real time, rather than delivering prepared ones. "I'm here because she lets me stand next to her." Brooke felt those words move through her chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the gala's lighting and everything to do with 11 years of standing in rooms alone and finally standing in one that had someone who understood exactly what that had cost her. She reached over and took his hand. Her move, her choice, her terms, the same terms she'd set at a hotel bar in Seoul on the worst night of her life, now meaning something entirely different than they had then. The room saw it. Neither of them were performing it for the room. 6 months later, Brooke Alfred Lee opened the Seoul and Atlanta offices of Alfred Legal International on the same Tuesday morning. The simultaneous launches coordinated across time zones with the specific efficiency of a woman who had stopped asking whether she could do something and started asking how quickly. Gyeong-si attended the Seoul opening. He stood in the back, said nothing, and watched her work the room with the expression she had learned over 6 months meant something he was still finding words for. She found him, afterward, in the lobby. "You cancelled 2 meetings for this," she said. "I had something more important," he said. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had carried her father's words for 8 months, who had cleared paths without being asked and been honest about it when she called him on it, who had sat in the dark keeping watch and never once required anything from what he witnessed, who had stepped back from a podium in front of 400 people to give her the floor, and then stood beside her while she used it. Was any of it actually an arrangement? She said. Not quite a question. He looked at her with the full weight of everything they had built in the space between a hotel bar and this lobby, between a signature and a choice, between almost and finally. I stopped pretending it was on day 2, he said. Brooke looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and straightened his lapel with both hands, and left her palms resting flat against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and certain beneath her hands, present and real, and entirely hers. Good, she said quietly. Me too. Outside, Seoul moved through its morning brilliant and indifferent and enormous. Inside the lobby of Alfred Legal International, a woman stood with her hands on her husband's chest and felt, for the first time in longer than she could calculate, that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. Not placed, not arranged, not contingency, chosen. And we've come to the end of it. Thank you for listening all the way through. I'd love to know what you felt about this story.